going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you from a beautiful day here in Tbilisi, Georgia. And I thought what we would do today is, I've had this thing running around through my mind. This is not going to be a long video, certainly not by my standards, but just a few things that I've had running around in my mind that may help somebody out there to understand something about their own habits and rituals and addictions. So before we do that, let me remind you, if you're new to the channel, please subscribe if you like what you're hearing. You can subscribe even if you don't. I don't care. Actually, I would care. That would be more of an honor in many ways. Feel free to press like. If you wish to contribute to the channel, there is a PayPal link below, and if you subscribe with more than $50 or more at a pop, or if you subscribe with $10 or more per month, you get free audio extras, and about 10 hours worth I will send to you. But basically, I'm glad you're here. So let's talk a little bit. Habit, addiction, and ritual. And I find these things all connected in a way. Habits. Well, we all have habits, don't we? Some people, well, brushing your teeth is a habit. You have to do it. It's a habit you have to do every day. Fixing your food is a habit. But more important than that is how you do it. So some people will, for instance, fix breakfast every morning. Now, there are different kinds of people. Some will make it similar every morning. Some other people may vary what they're doing. The people who make it similar every morning have formed a habit. They have the habit of frying their eggs in a certain way, the habit of cooking their oatmeal in a certain way. Interestingly enough, I'm living in Georgia. As far as I can tell, they don't have a breakfast culture here. They do sell, for instance, not the American brands, but things that look like them, little oaty, corny things that you pour into a bowl. And so you can have that for a quick breakfast. But they don't do fried eggs and bacon and eggs and, the kind of things that would form an English breakfast or an American breakfast or an Irish breakfast or even a French breakfast, the croissants and the bread and things like that. Why? Because they wake up late. They stay up much later than we do. And that's kind of a cultural habit. Spain has the cultural habit of staying up late. In Alaska, we did not. Maybe in the winter, maybe in the summer. In the winter, that's when we go to bed early. But in the summer, the sun is up where I lived, it was up 18 hours a day or more. And what was interesting is people who came from somewhere else to work in the summer would take that as a cue to have all-night bonfires. That's kind of a habit. It's a habit formed by the relationship to the sun. Now, I, who lived there for 22 years, soon got out of the stay up all night in the summer habit. And most of the time, I would get to bed earlier. And I made sure I had very, very thick curtains that the light couldn't shine through so I could get that sleep. But the habit comes with how you deal. So breakfast turns out is kind of a habit because you don't have to do it. Now, some people just like certain things. That's a different sort of thing. One could avoid habits by perpetually doing something new, although trying something new all the time could be a habit in itself. For instance, when people travel. Now, some people like to travel to the same place all the time. Most people in these days are not like that. They're always perpetually thinking of someplace new. And so for many people, traveling today is always about the new place. That's a habit. If you can't go to the same place over and over, you've got a habit of, in what Dr. Rookmacher calls chasing reality. You're desperate to see something new. Habits. Coffee drinking. That's a habit. Coffee versus tea drinking. I'm much more of a tea drinker, and I have a very specific habit for how I drink it. But here's one thing. I do not prepare tea for myself, certainly not here in Georgia, between about the middle of May, and I just started again at the beginning of September because the weather changed. So we'll say all of June, July, August, no hot tea drinking. So I'm able to break my habit and drink other things in the morning, orange juices and things like that. But of course, I have a very specific way of fixing my tea. And if you have tea, you have a very specific way of fixing your tea. So my tea, for instance, I have to have, well, you know what? I'm going to save this for when we talk about rituals in a moment. Because for me, tea drinking goes beyond simply being a habit. But is it an addiction? No. And I proved that by the fact that I don't do it for 3 months a year, which, alas, most coffee drinkers cannot say. Coffee becomes an addiction, but we'll get to addiction in a moment. Ritual, addiction, habit, these things are all related. And what you'll start to see is that habits are the things you do almost unconsciously. You will notice, I notice this around eating particularly. What often happens is that people will sit down with food, and it's amazing what you can learn about people by how they eat. Many people, as soon as food is set before them in any sort of meal situation, will suddenly go on autopilot. They will go, this is how I eat my food. And so they will have a habit. I mean, some people will make loud noises. They're not, some people leave their mouths open while they eat, that kind of thing. But other people will make these grinding sounds with their teeth, and, this kind of thing. And I've heard all sorts of strange sounds. And it's very hard to point this out to someone because they don't know they're doing it. Or if they do know, they're dimly aware of any effect it has on anyone else. And like I say, you learn a lot about people when you are around them, not in one meal. Most people, if you invite them to a dinner, invite them to a restaurant, share a picnic lunch with them, you're not going to notice the habits because everybody is in what we'll call new mode. Like I said, new, if you do things or change things up regularly, you get out of a habit. Sometimes it's important to have things that are new. I often do this where I have, we'll switch up a kind of food I'm eating. Like, for instance, I don't eat many kinds of foods in the summer, particularly here because it's so hot. So I stopped cooking so much. I stopped roasting. No soups. Soups are too hot. No hot foods, no hot food. And it's just too hot to have that stuff. Occasionally I will make something quick and hot, but most of the time I start moving into a different zone entirely. Although I'll still, fry my eggs in the morning. That's the most habitual I probably am, is I like eggs. But even there, I have little rituals. And one is to find the best thing to fry them that's possible. So there's a store here that sells duck fat. Well, duck fat is much better to fry eggs in than any vegetable oil. Vegetable oils are the lowest. To me, that's the lowest. There's almost no nutrition there compared to even something like butter. Butter is a wonderful thing to fry an egg in. these are my habits. But as you can see, I've started entering into the process more, and so they become a ritual. Now, to me, the habits that a person is not conscious of, these are, I mean, like I said, you see them with people eating, not once in a while, because then they're on their best behavior. If you come over to their house and they're eating, many people, not all people, believe me, but many people are on their best behavior. I have been to places where people are absolutely not on their best behavior when you first eat with them. But if you start eating with people, like, you have a roommate or you have a dormitory or something, and you start noticing certain strange things that start happening over and over. And I mentioned food because food is one of those things that, like I say, you set the food down and people go on autopilot. They don't enter in. Now, one way, of course, that I've learned, if I really want to get someone to consider how loud they are, I find the worst thing to do is simply saying, "Why are you eating so loud? Do you realize the sounds you're making? They sound, they're beyond annoying." No, that doesn't help. Because the person then feels, they feel trapped because they're in a moment where they have not entered into their habit. They can't, many habits people can't question. They just do them. So what I will do instead is create a situation where it's important to not make a lot of noise while you're eating. That's one way to do it. How would I do that? Maybe watch a quiet movie with them while you're eating. I mean, normally I don't like watching any sort of movie with someone, but in this case, maybe it might be good. Listen to something that like classical music that requires quiet, and don't tell them about how they're eating. Just tell them, like, wait, listen to this passage. In other words, you're trying to get them to enter into their habit so that they come to it themselves. And like I said, you can't really be successful with this. It's a difficult thing to get a person to understand their habits. And as I'm talking to you now, you should start thinking about your own habits, because you see, I'm not talking to anyone in specific. Therefore, I can't be offending you, because I'm not saying, you choose strange. You make, I've met some people who make weird gurgling sounds and such when they're drinking something. Or, like they'll be like, ah. They're always going, ah. Whenever they drink something, it's like they're always drinking something hot, even when it's cold. They're, ah. And they don't hear themselves. They can't enter into the process of what they're doing. Now, other people, let's talk about another thing. There are habits of thinking, habits of arguing, habits of mind, habits of relationships. And these are probably, the habits of relationships can be some of the darkest things, because people will often go, again, on what they become unconscious of how they're treating other people. They may not see what they're doing to people. I am certainly, this has affected my life. And I have been fortunate to have a few people in my life who have pointed things out. A very, very good friend of mine, when I was about 22, 23 years old, pointed out that I was a very interesting person. And yet, when I would get into a conversation with someone, I would just start to dominate it and then start to say things as almost to prove that my life was interesting. And this older woman actually very politely wrote me a letter and said, "Bern, you are such an interesting person, but you're trying to prove that you're interesting, and you don't need to." And that helped me to get into this habit. It didn't help me to resolve it right away, because things like this are formed in a deep cauldron of who we are. This is why habits, entering into anyone else's habit, including your own, is a dangerous, dangerous business, because you're often unaware of why you do what you do. So, habits of relationships, where is that formed? Well, in my case, I think it was formed by having a mother that really didn't listen to me, so I had to keep trying to prove what I was saying. and to get my mother to pay attention to me. I mean, that's the simple psychological answer, but of course it's much deeper than that. When we have, a lot of times people today, I think with habits, what they try to do is, if a person's an introvert, they will find other introverts to like pat them on the back and say, oh, good for you. Or if they're an extrovert, they'll find other extroverts to pat them on the back and say, good for you. Not realizing that we all kind of have to be everything. There is a time to get out of your shell or to go back into it. There is a time to think of other people. So an introvert may need to think about somebody besides themselves when they're in a situation where someone needs to be talked to. And if you've been, politely patted on the back by the quote-unquote introvert community, give me a break, then what you're going to do is you're not going to talk to the people you need to talk to because you say to yourself, I'm an introvert. Well, introversion is a habit. A lot of people, what's happened is people today try to make things that are habitual into things that are innate, things you are born with, things that cannot be interrupted, immutable characteristics. So the introvert is immutably an introvert. They cannot change. And the extrovert is immutably an extrovert. They cannot change. So the loudmouth who comes into the room, takes over the conversation, you know what? That person, and I've been both, so I can speak from authority here, that person needs to shut up and listen to other people. And I mean really listen, not just get something out of them, not move them around like chess pieces on a board. So, when I was younger, I was extremely withdrawn. When I became a Christian at the age of 15, I started coming out of my shell, and then I became too much out of my shell. And to this day, I'm happy being alone. I'm also happy with other people. I'm generally not happy around other people acting stupid, as often happens in certain social situations. And the reason for that is because it saddens me to see people acting stupid, particularly when they're doing things, getting drunk, and essentially doing the things that, are considered sowing your wild oats or whatever, I mean, the most recent one I think I hear all the time is, experimenting. And so now people experiment in ways they never experimented before sexually. And of course, there are sexual habits. These also are quite deep and ingrained inside of us. And we need to ask questions about that stuff. Now, do I think you should sit there and write a list of all the stuff you have habits about and question it? Not quite like that, because that would be almost mechanical. Rather, you need to ask questions. For instance, when you find certain things create problems for you, which they will. If you're a human being, you're going to have problems. Then you need to say, why do I keep doing this? Now, the smaller habits, like how you eat and chew, those are actually much tougher to deal with. In a weird way, those are things that are much closer inside of you, almost methods of coping with the world that are so integrated into you, it's really hard to enter into them. But still, I would say that is important, and to help each other to see them in polite ways and not in the kind of ways that people have today of trying to shame people. But the other habits that are much more on the surface, you might say, like I say, food, preening, cleaning yourself, how you take a shower, these things end up becoming habits that are almost impossible to get to without really thinking about it. And some of them can have very long-term consequences that are damaging. So if you're the kind of person who makes loud sounds with your teeth while you eat, you may eventually pay for that by losing teeth. It doesn't happen overnight. That's one of the things about habits. Nothing as a habit, if you do it once, most of that stuff isn't going to hurt you. If you do it 100 times, it's not going to hurt you. If you do it 1,000 times, something's starting to happen. But some of these habits we do 1,000,000 times, 100,000 times. then it starts to have an effect. I would say many things that eventually cause us sickness are things that we do over and over and over without questioning. But then there's another thing. Some of these habits we're very, very, very aware of. And yet we keep doing them, and we know we shouldn't. We have another word for that, and that's addiction. Addiction, well, there's been a lot written, discussed, filmed about the addiction process. And sometimes you get the idea that addiction is all just a disease. Well, I would agree it can become a disease. But no, for instance, a simple glass of wine doesn't make a person an alcoholic. A single puff on a cigarette doesn't mean you are necessarily addicted to it. Even worse, drugs. Once, and I'm not saying this to do this ever once, but once doesn't necessarily kill you, which is what addicts people is like, heroin users. They try it once. It's like, debt consolidation. But suddenly everything else doesn't matter, and the only thing that matters is that feeling. You see the first time, it's like amazing. All my junkie friends have told me. Former junkie friends. People I've knew in California and New York. First time just is amazing. And then you have to go after the experience again. And in the law of diminishing returns, it's never as good the second time or the third. And it gets worse and worse. And you have to buy more to get the same experience. And now you're on the road to addiction. But little things are like that too. So, I know people who drink, maybe they have some coffee in the morning. Then I know people who have deep levels of coffee breath that are just almost poisonous. And you wonder how stained their insides are by their habit. That that coffee becomes the number one thing in their life. I know people who it's like, I can't go to bed. It's 11 o'clock. I'll have some more coffee. And I also know people whose sleep patterns are completely destroyed by coffee. What most people don't realize, you quit it, and guess what? You're going to have insomnia for quite a while. And a lot of people say, well, I quit coffee and now I have insomnia. Well, so coffee wasn't the problem. No, they don't understand the deep level biological nightmares that are going on inside of your body trying to understand what's going on. And of course, there are pills that people take for different reasons to cure themselves. And it's easy to become addicted to those. And yet at the same time, sometimes people have to take certain medications that change their biology ever so slightly in order to, basically stay alive. I mean, blood medications for reducing blood pressure these days, you have to do it. And if you don't, you might die a lot earlier than you thought you were going to. So we can stay alive much longer because of these medications. We are, in a sense, addicted to them, and at the same time, maybe that isn't creating a lot of problem. It doesn't have the same kind of psychological effect that, say, a stimulant or a narcotic or a psychedelic might have. And a lot of people will say, well, you can't get addicted to, and then they'll list drugs on the side here, like, acid. You can't get addicted to acid. And a lot of people are under this weird impression that the only addictions are physiological, where that's not true at all. And as soon as you enter a realm like gambling, you realize there is nothing physiological going on here, and there are total gambling addicts out there, just as there are total porn addicts. And what does that say about addiction? Well, it says addiction isn't simply something that goes into your body, takes a hold of your chemical systems, and latches on, and if you stop it, suddenly you go into reverse. But gambling addiction tells us something very strange. The gambling addiction is not about winning. I am convinced, and this is also relates to video games. I am convinced, I remember watching my mother play a form of solitaire for years and years. And she would do this one particular form. It was called Spider. And for 10 years, she had this on her computer. And once she lost it, she did something to try to do it. And she started really having a problem. So I found it again for her, put it on. It was something she would do in the afternoon to kind of unwind. I don't know. But it was definitely an addiction. But I'm convinced in this case, in gambling addictions, in video game addictions, it's something very strange. It's like a pattern addiction. I think there are visual addictions and pattern addictions. I think gambling and video games are primarily pattern addictions. And we don't understand this. What is it inside of us that gets connected to patterns so deeply that we cannot question it? And I would say it's this. Here's one way to understand it. Why do we like music? What's music? It's various patterns. Things that repeat in certain ways, but when they are interrupted in a slightly different way, it's a different song. So how many songs have a G, a C, a D, and an E minor in them? Thousands, millions of songs, I suppose, have that some variation on those chords. And yet people will get completely absorbed in a song. Now, this is different than, say, gambling. Nevertheless, if a song, now I think there is a kind of a musical addiction as well. I know someone, every time I would play for her Bob Dylan's song, what is it? Blood on the Tracks. I'm trying to think of the song. Anyway, it was a Bob Dylan song. And every time I would play that for her, she would just kind of space off into this reverie. Well, she was thinking about a certain time in her life that obviously had something to do with romance. Now, here's what's interesting. I thought it was the song she liked. So I found a version of Bob Dylan singing this song with like 5 or 6 extra verses in a live performance. And you know what? That didn't do it for her. So it wasn't the song. It had to be precisely the same recording. It could not be an alternative recording. That says something to me about this thing with patterns. Tarkovsky, at the end of the movie The Sacrifice, makes a very interesting statement through one of his characters about there's something mechanical in music. And that somehow there's something in us that meets that. And I think when that thing gets disordered, and since we're human beings, there's always a temptation to have these things disordered. How is it people can like such bad music? And believe me, they do. I mean, I know enough about music to know that people like terrible music. And here's one of the things that people who sell music know. If I play you something enough, you will eventually develop associations with it, and you will eventually come to like it. How else can certain songs get stuck in your head? The earworm. The Ohrwurm, I think it's originally a German word. The earworm. How is it? See, look, there are commercial jingles that I remember from the 1960s that will suddenly crop up in my thinking without me ever, in the intermediary time, 45 years or so, I've never thought about this jingle at all. And all of a sudden, I'll hear like a beneficial boop, boop, you're good for more. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible song stuck in my brain about the beneficial insurance company. And that came to my mind last week. Why? Patterns. Patterns get inside of us and they connect to our emotions somehow, as in the musical example. And I think this is what happens in the gambling example. But of course, visual things, see pornography, create addictions as well. And what is it we're addicted to? Well, that one specifically is a really complex issue that I am not going to go into right now because this is not the place to go into it. But that gives you the idea that it's not the only visual thing we get addicted to. Why do people start to dress like other people? Why are there all these girls in Georgia who have seen something in a visual format of some other girl in another country wearing ripped jeans? Why are they wearing ripped jeans? Now, that fad is changing. But nevertheless, there's something very strange about our connection to patterns and to images. That, part of it is there is an emotional, social relationship to these things. So it's very hard for people to, I'm sitting there going like, why did all the guys start like shaving the sides of their heads? And don't they realize that's kind of like what was happening in the Soviet Union and the Third Reich? Well, no, they don't, because they don't look at that many photos from that era. And then, it's just kind of like, I say the word hipster, guy. Whatever else happens in your mind in the next few minutes, as I say that, all I can say is this was a pattern that started to be formed in the late 1990s, early aughts, and now there's all these guys who kind of look this way. But here's where it gets really bizarre. So, I've mentioned this before, how when I was young, almost no guy had a bald head. Even guys who were losing their hair didn't have a bald head. They would have the center, and then they'd have a little bit of hair on the side, but they never would shave their head. Then in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the skinheads came around and started shaving their heads. Also, when I was growing up, you saw very few people wearing truckers' caps and baseball caps. People might wear it for their team. They might, if they actually worked, they might, S&H Trucking Company or some product, they might wear it because they actually worked for those people. But in the early 1980s, there were people who, I remember about 1984, going to there weren't hipsters yet. These were what you'd call post-punks. Going to a party filled with some of the coolest people in New York City, because no one was hip at that time. Some of the coolest people in New York City. And what did I see? Shaved heads a la skinheads, but repurposed for much more kind of radical lefty artsy stuff. Truckers' caps worn ironically, and goatee beards. And now, if I give you that image, bald head, goatee mustache, trucker's cap, we're dealing with a working class guy in Iowa or Missouri, or there's some of that on the streets of Georgia. What happened? Images somehow spread, and people get connected to those images, and that's what I mean. How do we transfer images in this sort of way? How do we pull our image identity from other people? How also does it move down the food chain from the artsy intellectual folk down to the working classes? Because we saw the same thing with the hippies. Originally, long hair was like, there's all these country songs about guys wearing long hair and how like crazy they were. Later, the country guys had the long hair. The working class guys had the long hair. And it's just a very strange thing. So image addiction is a real thing. And the problem with addiction, real addiction, is dangerous. Because you know you're doing something that is a habit out of control. Sometimes it is physiological, but as in the case of, certain kinds of internet addictions, certain kinds of video game addictions, certain kinds of gambling addictions, I'm convinced that these things, it's like somehow, how do the patterns get inside of us? How do the images get inside of us and hook us the way they do? And I'm not going to answer this question here. I certainly have a lot of thoughts about it. But I'm just posing the question for you to think about. So, what is the answer? Shall we let all of our habits go, just simply remain as they are? No. Not if you want them to do something good. So, I mentioned my tea. So I could be one of these people who simply has to have tea. Well, I'm not. And I'll tell you, if someone comes to me and says, "Oh, Bern, you like tea," then they'll hand me a Lipton tea bag. Out of politeness, I'll drink it. But you know what? That's not tea to me. That's just some store-bought commodity that has very little flavor. For me, I enter into the process. One of the reasons I like tea better than coffee, every now and then I'll have some. Last time I had some, I was in Italy back in 2017. It was December. And Enzo Mancuso, who is a Sicilian puppeteer, told me, "Hey, I'll buy you a cappuccino." So he had his puppeteer henchman take me down to this Italian place in Sicily, and they gave me a cappuccino. And of course, the Italians, when I told them that Americans drank it after noon, they all laughed, much in the same way as they laughed when I told them that Americans put pineapple on pizza, because they just said, like, it's just wrong. It's wrong to drink a cappuccino after noon. It's a morning drink, and it was quite tasty. I have no problem with the taste of coffee, although when I was young I used to kind of like coffee. But and the cappuccino was wonderful. It just had this wonderful roasted flavor. No problem at all with it. My problem comes from observing coffee drinkers and what happens to them and how they start kind of getting on a certain kind of a track. And after a while, the only question that seems to matter when they arrive somewhere is, "Do you have any coffee?" And to me, that's a habit that needs to be investigated and to ask what in the heck's going on. And it's a habit that very probably has moved into the addiction category, and not in a funny way. People often, "I have a coffee addiction." I wouldn't laugh about it. People often laugh about their addictions. For instance, smokers often will have cute little pet nicknames. "I'll take my cancer sticks," and they joke about it. Alcohol. It seems like the more addicted you are to drink, the more pet names you have for it. It's a very strange little thing we do with our addictions, is to give it slang little names, cute little names, things that kind of turn it into, oh gosh, it's just kind of cute. I had a friend who'd say, like, "Yeah, I need my butts," talking about cigarette butts. It's just like, it's a cute little thing, if you look in, I think it's the American Dictionary of Slang, under slang names for, just in America, for drink. I mean, there's like at least 100 different names for getting drunk. Same in England, same probably in most countries. It's just all these names getting obliterated, tanked, smashed, mashed. I could go on and on. I don't want to make this a list of alcohol names, drunk names. But to me, one way to rescue a habit, if you can do it, if it's not an addiction. And you see, the problem with an addiction is it ruins the thing you're doing. So you get to the point where you can no longer live without this thing. And it ruins your ability. For instance, pornography ruins your ability to see the beauty of women. Unless, of course, you're watching gay male pornography, then it ruins your ability to look at men. it's, the video gaming addiction ruins your ability to simply enjoy a video game. The gambling addiction ruins your ability to simply play a card game and enjoy yourself. The addiction of narcotics ruins your ability to use the drugs when you need them and then stop when you don't. Here's your codeine, here's your and under serious circumstances, your morphine, because your pain is terrible. But if you're addicted to it, if someone gives you more of that kind of opioid, you're in deep trouble. And, the addiction of all of these things ruins your ability to appreciate them. I once had a friend, I was talking with someone about this a couple days ago, people who were saying that in America, there's a difference between the way people drink in America and the way they do in Europe. And in Europe, often people grow up in a culture where drink and food go together. But in America, they are often separate, so that you get people who just go hang out at the bar, or people who finally, when they start drinking, just start binge drinking. And I had a friend once who told me, well, what's the point of alcohol? Tasting it, what's that about? The only point of alcohol is to get drunk. Well, you see, that ruins your ability to enjoy the flavors of these distilled and brewed and fermented beverages. So, and it's not that a person getting drunk turns them into an alcoholic. There are two different things at work here. And I don't want to go off into just a discussion of alcoholism. But to rescue, and again, the problem with the coffee addiction is it ruins your ability to actually appreciate coffee, because you can't enter into the habit and stop it, which is why it's very important for me to spend 3 or 4 months a year where I don't drink tea, so that I can look forward to it. I just started drinking English tea, PG Tips again last week, and I'm like, oh, this tastes so good. Because my taste buds have not been simply anesthetized to the flavor. So here's what I do as my little ritual for tea drinking. No, I never ever personally will buy a tea bag of anything, because to me it's like, I have to go get the little, they're like a little holder that's a tea ball on the end of I can get different ones. These little balls and little containers and spoon kind of things that will hold, you pour your leaves of tea into it, and I'll use that always, and because I want a strong flavor when I do drink it. I will sometimes add not brown sugar, but raw sugar to it, sometimes honey, sometimes milk, so I'll have different sort of flavor. Sometimes in the middle of the winter I might go as far as adding thick cream to it for a different sort of an effect. Lemon sometimes, but always thoughtfully. I don't add lemon to black tea. I add lemon to green teas or to fruit teas, or lime. Also with tea, I will make a pot. I have to make sure I have a pot. So I need a few pieces of equipment here. I need the water pot for hot water, and I need the teapot, which should be big enough to have at least a few cups out of it. It can't be a small one. I'm not pouring little dainty cups of tea. This is not a Japanese tea ceremony. In fact, my teacups are rather large. I look for the largest ones. C.S. Lewis once said, you can't get a cup of tea big enough for me, and I understand exactly what he means. But then I have, so I'll use one of these balls that's kind of like has a container about this big on the end, a little kind of a strange plier-like device that works in reverse, opens up the tea, opens it up like a little bit of a, almost like a puppet. Ooh. I'll show you a bit of one here in a second. But then what I'll do is I'll use each one once, and then I'll put two of them aside. I have two that I go back and forth on, and I'll put them both aside, and then I'll put the these tea balls in a little porcelain container facing opposite each other. That way I know that symbol says to me, these are good for one more. So I'll put them both in together to have one more nice big cup out of them the next day. But when they're facing the same way, that means they're done, and I should rinse these out. And then what I do is use them as, once I make sure there's no sugar residue on the leaves, I'll run the water through them, get a little bit of that out, and then use them for fertilizer on my potted plant. Here's a picture of the potted plant that is growing because of tea leaves. So, and then I clean them up, hang them up, and then I start the process again, where the next day I'll use one, then I'll use the other, on the day after, on the third day I use them both, unless I really get desperate for tea. And usually tea will be a morning thing for me, although occasionally I'll have it later in the day. But what I've done is I've entered into the process. I think about the ingredients. I think about the flavor. I also have lots and lots and lots of teas. I go to places to buy tea. For instance, I buy Georgian teas, and they have black Georgian tea. Now, what's interesting about black Georgian tea is it has a flavor very different from any tea I've ever bought anywhere else. It feels a bit, I feel almost more of the leaf in it. I can't explain it. It's not tannic, but it's got a very different flavor. But Earl Grey, I just don't get any Earl Grey. I've spent quite a while thinking about Earl Greys. And for instance, there is one House du Thé or something like that, Chez, what is it? Anyway, it's a French Maison du Thé. That is a French franchise place, but they have a location here in Georgia. And I will, once a year, go there and splurge on some new teas. And some I'll get are very much, I will look for very flavorful scents, sometimes fruits, sometimes, but if I want a jasmine tea or a green tea. So in other words, and I'll smell it and I know what it's going to be. And then there's the process of drinking it, which shouldn't just happen in one gulp without thinking about it. It's something that is meant to sit and reflect on and enjoy. That's why I don't have to have this. Like if I go to someone's house, they go, this often happened to me in Alaska. Bern, I know you like tea. Would you like some? I go, well, if the alternative is coffee, yeah, sure, give me tea. But they don't make it the way I do, but that's okay. I don't need that. I don't need my ritual to be performed by other people for me. But it is a personal thing. Now, having said that, I have a ritual related to buying books and building bookshelves. I have rituals related to my libraries and how I display them and how I do them. And I'm still improving. I'm still trying to make them good. I don't, for instance, I do not simply buy an LP album or a CD and simply put it on the shelf. Well, I never put it up randomly. That would be impossible. Nor do I put it up alphabetically. I put it up very specifically, and that is to say I have to listen to it. And this is very important when I have sometimes bought and sold used record collections, and then there's certain things I keep for myself. So if you've got 20 albums sitting there looking at you, you're not going to sit there and listen to them all day, but you do want to know what they are. And so what I'll do is I can't put anything on my shelves until I've at least sampled it, spent time with it, and then I say, oh, this is that. And so I put it in a very specific place, usually by country, by style within the country, historically within the style, and in rare cases where there's just too much clogging up an area, alphabetically, because it's too many 1980s bluegrass albums or something like that. So to me, life, you enter into it. And I think you can do this with gardening, and you can do this with how you deal with your clothing, even with your bathroom rituals. You can enter into the process. You can think about the kind of toothpaste you're using. You can think about what kind of shampoo you have and the effect it has on you. And not in a, as the British would say, a Ponzi way. Not in a way that's just to be. I mean, some people go way too crazy and make their rituals addictions. To me, a ritual can never be an addiction. But if you make it an addiction, now you've really created a problem for yourself, because it starts to become holy in the wrong sense. And of course, in mentioning rituals, there are, of course, rituals related to faith and worship, which I'm not going to discuss, although obviously they are related. And I find certain churches end up with really bad rituals because they've tried to get away from rituals. But what do they create? They create a new liturgy with bad pop folk singing. They create a new liturgy with, instead of beautiful art in the churches, they just have felt art because we want, felt like children's art practically, because we want to be inclusive. And you know what? Many of these places that tried to make people inclusive, they've disappeared because it didn't work. Because what people really want is beauty. They really want ritual that is beautiful. And I think part of the importance of having rituals is that we add beauty to our lives. Because there is a beauty to tea. There is even a beauty to coffee. There's a beauty to the human face, which is why you don't want to pollute that by seeing people in their most private act in a public way. There is a beauty to so much of what we do. And yet, for some reason, human beings want to ignore the beauty. I think it's too much for them. See my lecture on beauty, which is on another video somewhere. I think people want to essentially think, oh, I'm just a common person. Beauty isn't something meant for me. Again, see my video on beauty. Because I think, and this relates to art as well, the point is to connect to each other. See, when people come over to my house, like in Alaska, I would have people over, and they would always be like, what are we having for tea, Bern? Well, the reason they would do this is because they knew it was going to be unusual. And that creates beauty in relationships. And that's what it all comes down to in the end. Our habits do not create beauty unless they are entered into. Our addictions are positively ugly. But there is true beauty in the world. And we can help add to it by entering into what we are doing. So I'll just leave it there. I don't know why I had this on my mind, but I hope it's meaningful to someone out there. But this is part of how I live, to think about things. Have I adjusted all of my habits? Oh, no. There are still habits that every now and then I'll kind of catch side-eye and go like, oh, are you doing that? And then you got to think about it. Do I have addictions? Yeah. Some of them revolve around things like sugar. And I'm still trying to figure out the best way to keep the sweetness without endangering my health. We all have issues, things. Some people, like I say, it can be an addiction that's physiological, but it can also be an addiction that's an addiction to these weird patterns that we get stuck with, turning the patterns from meaningful into anti-meaning. And then there's the visual addictions, the wanting to be like other people, wanting to look like something, having no sense of oneself in the world, and adopting imagery, or seeing images one wants to possess. See my video on desire. So we'll leave it there. Again, subscribe, like, share the video if you think it's worth sharing. There's nothing political going on here much, but these days everyone can be offended at something, and I hope to have offended at least the right people with this. But really, we have to enter into our own selves. And I think, and I say this as a Christian, I have to do this with God's help. To create the beauty, to enter into the habits, to challenge the addictions. Because it can't be done. and with each other's help. So this is Bern in Tbilisi, Georgia, saying, well, Anadromous means swimming against the stream. And one of the best streams you can swim against is the stream of kind of like unreasoned habit, and certainly the stream of addiction. And I'll see you again soon. Take care.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.